In March of 1981, retired Secret Service agent James K. Fox showed me a collection of 9 black and white autopsy photographs of the body of President John F. Kennedy. Several weeks later, Fox shared a set with me under the condition that I not reveal them or their origin until after his death. He died in 1987, and in 1988 I allowed David Lifton to use some of the photos in the re-release of Best Evidence. These photographs have subsequently appeared on numerous television programs and in several other books. In 1989, Harry Livingstone and Robert Grodin released their book High Treason, and although most of the pictures in High Treason were from the set which James Fox had given me, there was one exception, one notable exception. I had hoped that the release of the autopsy photos would begin to clear up many of the mysteries and questions surrounding the medical evidence. But the release of High Treason, with its new picture, generated even more confusion. This video is being produced with consumer equipment, but I believe you'll find that what it lacks in technical quality, it more than makes up for in detail and understanding. The purpose of this video is to provide the assassination research community with a clear understanding of what autopsy photos are now in private possession, which ones have been released, and some of the disturbing anomalies which are evident. As I said, there were 9 pictures in the Fox set. 7 of them were reprinted in this 1988 re-release of Best Evidence. These were the same pictures that were used on the 1988 Nova broadcast featuring the Dallas Doctors, and on Lifton's 3 appearances on hard copy in the spring of 1990. One of the most compelling pictures, one we call the Stare of Death, was also reproduced in this edition of Anthony Summers' book Conspiracy. In March of 1989, Harry Livingstone and Robert Grodin released their book High Treason. Again, it too contained the Fox photographs, but with an additional photograph that was not in the Fox collection. It was then that I learned that there were other photographs, other autopsy photographs, in private possession, aside from the Fox photographs, which actually differ from the Fox photographs in some important respects. Those 5 photographs we call the Grodin Collection. The 9 Jim Fox gave me we call the Fox Collection. In order to understand these anomalies, it's vital that you be able to differentiate between Grodin photographs and Fox photographs. And although we only have 1.5 of the 5 in the Grodin collection, we will attempt to educate you now on the differences in the Fox collection and the Grodin collection. Okay, let's begin by attempting to get a clear understanding of the inventory of the 2 separate groups of photographs, and then we'll get into some of the differences and what those differences seem to indicate. Picture number 1 is Fox F1, also known as the Stare of Death shot. We have the signature there, F1. There are 2 pictures in the Fox collections which appear to be almost identical, but if you examine them closely, you can determine that they are 2 separate pictures. That is F1, which you see there, and this photograph, which is Fox F2, which is a comparable photograph. The way you can tell that they are different, though, and that they do reveal different detail, number 1 is in Fox F2, this background area here is much darker. It appears that perhaps Mr. Stringer used a different exposure on his camera, but we're glad that he did, because in so doing you can read the writing here on the towel which says U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland. The other way you can tell that F1 and F2 are different is when you examine the upper left-hand corner of both photographs. You begin to see the 4-inch tiles that go vertically up the wall at the autopsy room there at Bethesda. In F2, you can see one complete tile here, very nearly all of the one next to it, and perhaps a fourth of the one above this first tile. Whereas back on F1, you can only see really a portion of the tile right there, not the entire tile. Excuse me, and these are printed to the margin. So you're actually seeing two separate photographs taken from just a slightly different angle. Again, the exposure on this is much lighter, and you can see two artifacts over here, and we'll discuss those more in detail later. And it's so light that it's washed out pretty much the signature there of Bethesda Naval Hospital, U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland. I know some writers have written different things about what that says. It says U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland. So Fox F1 here, and Fox F2, if you see it, is the one with the darker contrast and where you can actually see what's on the towel. Moving on now to Fox F3. And this is where we get into, we'll discuss this picture in quite a bit of detail in a little while, in the corresponding photographs in the Grodin Collection. Very simply, it is a photograph where the president's body's been rolled up on the left side on the autopsy table. This here you're looking at is the front of the shirt of the person who has turned the president over. There's another hand here holding him. He's gripping the head. There's a ruler beginning to come in here, and we're going to talk a lot about this supposed entry wound and do some very close-up shots on that in a minute. But just for identity's sake, this is Fox F3. Fox F4 is a relatively straightforward shot, which is the left lateral profile of the president. There's been some discussion about this picture, and there are some anomalies in this one which are rather troubling. One of them you almost begin to see here, in that it seems to be almost like a splice line there. I don't want to jump the gun on that discussion, but this is Fox F4, which is the left lateral shot. Now Fox F5 is, again, the president's been rolled up on his left side. He's being held. The head is now, instead of the head being supported, it's sort of draped over. We have our ruler there, and it's on the back, supposedly making some reference point to here, the supposed entry wound for the pristine bullet. That's Fox F5, which is a back shot, we call it, the full back shot. Fox F6 and F7 are very similar in view. In fact, there's a great deal of stereoscopic information we've gathered from these, and these are two that we're having getting a lot of information from, and I'll discuss that in more detail in a moment. Fox F6, it shows this large defect in the head, and the way you distinguish it from Fox F7 is that in F6, as you can see, you can view actually down the president's abdomen to this towel, whereas in Fox F7, you don't see that. The camera has been lowered somewhat so that you don't see the abdomen of the towel. It's almost looking straight on. So that's Fox F7 here, and F6 is the one where you see the abdomen. Now the other two photographs, I'm not totally sure that they are two separate photographs, but they were two separate ones in the Fox collection, so I try to maintain the integrity of what he gave me. He gave me 9 photographs. 2 of them were this somewhat bizarre and hard to orient shot of a ruler coming in here and the inside of the head with the scalp reflected back, and we've discovered something in this photograph which is could be very revealing, and we'll discuss that more later. Again, Fox F8 and Fox F9 almost appear identical. In fact, it's virtually impossible to distinguish between the two, except for there is some, I don't know whether this is, I believe this may have been on the original negative, that seems beam of sunlight coming in there. But there were 2 separate shots like this in the Fox set. They look almost identical. We call them Fox F8 and F9. They are apparently the head with the scalp reflected. As you can see, it's been peeled back here, and we'll discuss the orientation and perhaps some of the detail that those pictures show in just a moment. Getting into the Grodin Collection, in discussions with David Lifton and Harry Livingstone, there's been a great deal of confusion about exactly what views were in the Grodin set. In February of 1991, I asked Robert Grodin if I could see his entire collection of pictures, and he showed them to me and allowed me to make copious notes, particularly in comparison to the Fox photographs. Again, the Grodin set, the 5 Grodin sets pictures are all in color. Grodin G1 is identical. We're actually here, this is Fox F7, which you saw in just a few moments ago. We've also given it a dual designation, Grodin G1, because the Grodin color shot is identical to this, with one or very vivid discrepancy dealing with contrast, which we'll talk about later. But Grodin G1 is identical to this photograph from the top of the head. In fact, it's sort of troublingly identical. This flash reflection here appears identical in the Grodin picture, and that may indicate that they were duplicate pictures. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Let's get through the inventory. Grodin G2 is identical to Fox F4, the left lateral shot. Again, there's one exception on this, and that is that the background appears to be obliterated in the Grodin photograph, whereas here you can see the background, the tiles on the wall, there's an arm and hand here, and the telephone. And there may be a reason for that, and as we discuss each picture individually, I'll give you what may be the reason that that photograph was the background obliterated on it. Getting into G3 and G4, we have a sort of a composite videograph picture that was taken from off of television, one of the specials. The Grodin G3 and G4 correspond very much to Fox F3. Again, the body's rolled up on the left side, and it's, you know, you have the ruler showing the purported head wound. In F3, the camera is slightly elevated, so you're looking down. You can actually see some of the cheek here, and you're looking more downward as opposed to looking flush with the autopsy table at the back of the head. In my notes, I note that the two views that Grodin has, G3 and G4, of that same shot, you don't see the cheek. It's as if the camera has lowered down, as Stringer has squatted down to take a picture more flush with the back, and you can't tell here. This is the outline of the ruler, and so here on G3 you can actually see hair on the left side of the ruler. There is another picture, G4, in the Grodin collection, where you can actually see much more of the hair and much more on the left side of that ruler, and you can also see what Harry Livingstone has described as semicircles in this area, which appear in that. Again, it appears that G3 is basically the color version of House Select Committee Exhibit F48 here. Again, they've oriented it up and down. That seems to be a constant problem in this case with people getting the orientation of the pictures. It's actually like that, and it is basically this photograph here, G3, G4. Now we get into really the picture, the one picture from the Grodin collection that has been officially published, and actually gets into some startling detail, and we'll go right out of the inventory into discussion of that detail. This is Grodin Autopsy Photo G5, and I'd like you to just look at it for a moment or two, and we'll focus in on it a little bit sharper and a little bit closer now that we've established it in inventory as G5. Just look at it and compare it visually or manually if you have the autopsy photos or a copy of Best Evidence or High Treason with the Fox photos, the Stare of Death photos we've been referring to. When I first saw, this is Autopsy Photo G5 again, when I first saw this photograph, what struck me right away was this item here, which is been referred to, I think, by some as the V incision and different things. In the color photograph, which I have seen and studied quite carefully, it does appear to be just that it's almost like a V plug has been taken out of the scalp there. Now I want you to understand we're going to deal with 2 points here on the forehead, on the over the right eye. We'll call this point 1, or anomaly 1, and this area here, this little swath of hair, anomaly number 2, because it's important as we re-examine the Fox photographs. Remember, in an autopsy, the body is laid on the table. There's the presentation. The autopsist records the height, weight, race, well-nourished, gets into an external examination of any apparent distinguishing features on the body, some of which may have led to cause of death, things of that nature. And there are photographs taken. And these photos, this photo should be G5, should be identical to Fox F1 and 2. It should have be no change in anything to do with the body. And as you can see in a moment, there is a change. So we have this, we'll call it the V incision. I think that's what most people refer to it, over the right eye. And then we have what we call anomaly. That'll be anomaly 1, and this little area here will be anomaly 2. Let's go to Fox. Let's go back to the Fox photos, to F1, the stare of death picture. And this is what had shocked me in it quite a bit initially, because I had studied this photograph quite a bit. This is the area, and initially you say, well, there's the V incision. But when you're carefully examining the photograph, you'll see that there's actually a black area there. It's sort of a trapezoid. I'm tracing it out with this. And if you have a good quality reproduction of that picture, you can see that. It does not appear to be the simple incision that we see in Grodin G5. Now you might say, well, when they went back to this angle with black and white, red goes to black, and we'll discuss that more in a moment in contrast anomaly. But when you examine this, and remember too, we have two of these from a slightly different angle, and we can do stereo on it, Fox F1 and F2. This area here is, number one, it's reference black. It's not red. It's not a shade of dark black in the Fox photographs. It's black. It has been blacked out. That area has been blacked out in the Fox photographs. And if you examine these under the light carefully, you can see that. You can see this trapezoidal shape. Again, I'll outline it. It runs like that. In the original Grodin color photograph, you can see the white, especially on this side here of this supposed gash. Here, it's blacked out. And the question is why? So the question is why? Why is this area here blacked out in Fox F1 and F2? That argument may seem somewhat open to debate, but there are a number of other points about these two anomalies. I call them the blurred forehead anomalies, number 1 and number 2. And you'll see why when we look at the Fox photos again carefully. Once again, just to review, the area of the V incision on the Fox photographs, and it's right here at the top of the screen now, right there. And I did that so maybe you can see some of the outline of the trapezoid that is reference black. Now we should be able to see some indication, get some better indication when we look at the Fox photographs from the top of the head. So let's look at those. We should be able to get some understanding of what's happening on the forehead when we look at the area over the right eye in Fox F7 and F6. This is F7. This is a close-up view of the forehead. Now let me point something out to you again. Remember anomaly number 2, which we said is this little swath of hair here to the left of the V incision. Well, here, of course, we cannot see the V incision because it's too far down here on the right of the forehead. But look at this. Instead of a swath of hair, we have what initially gave me the title of what I call this, the blurred forehead anomaly. Number one, it's out of focus. The nose and everything here. In fact, you can, if looking at the photographs, you can actually see the eyebrows. The background's in focus. The foreground here is obviously in focus, but you've got this strange little triangle here, which really doesn't relate to anything. It's not hair. It's not an incision. The parts of it appear, again, to be reference black. But notice something very much I want you to notice on this. You've got a very well-defined triangle with one point pointing out here to the nose and the other point pointing here off to the side of the head and the third point disappearing into an imaginary line here into the hairline. When you go to Fox F6, which is taken from just a slightly higher angle, you don't have a triangle anymore. You have a circle. There may be like a triangular component under it, but it's a circle, and you can't tell it on here. Even on our closest focus, we can't show it to you. But there is an X inside this circle. And again, both of these sets are a little bit almost too exaggerated to do good 3D because of the angle of the shots. But here you have a triangle, a blurred triangle, and supposedly Mr. Stringer puts another load of film in his camera, another plate, and takes this picture, yet in this picture the triangle's disappeared, and what's there is a round blob that looks like it's dripped here across the picture, and right in the center of that round blob is an X. There's actually an X marked in there, and it was an X on Fox's original photographs. One of the most interesting things. Now, you can speculate as to why that is. I mean, that seems rather blatant. But when you look at the photographs, it's there. It's just a big round blob with an X inside of it. It appears to be obviously some retouching of the photograph, some very tacky retouching at that. So to review the blurred forehead anomaly problem, again, remember on the Grodin photograph G5, we have the incision. There's no comparable component to it on the Fox photos F1 and F2. And then we have, in the Grodin photographs, we have a swath of hair there. And then back to Fox, on Fox 7, we have a strange, blurry triangle there, which defies any real explanation, and is again reference black. And then by the time we get to Grodin, or excuse me, to get to Fox F6 here, we've got a circle there with an X in it and a drop. It would appear that there's obviously some attempt to mask something in the black and white photographs, and that attempt did not carry over necessarily to the forehead shots in the Grodin collection, because there again all we saw was the incision and the swath of hair. Without any narrative, let's just review those again. Just try to imagine how these points should appear in each picture, assuming that the pictures are taken at the same time. Again, this is the V incision, also known as Anomaly 1 on the forehead, and this is the swath of hair, Anomaly 2, which we eventually see in the Fox photographs becomes the blurred forehead anomaly. Let's just flip through those pictures several times, and let's just focus on those areas without any narrative, and I think you'll get the meaning of what I'm trying to get at. Let's go back to Grodin G5 for just a moment to try to understand what the blurred forehead anomaly may mean. It appears obvious that not only is this wound or incision or whatever it is not visible on the Fox photographs, it is apparent that the area has been blacked out. When I say reference black, that means that when we analyzed these with a computer with digitization, we found that that area was just like you'd put a painted over it with the opposite of whiteout, with a blackout or a retouching solution. It's also obvious that there's something here that's been retouched in this area based on those photographs we just looked at, where you have the triangle in one photograph and then you have the circle with an X in it in the next photograph. Keep in mind that these pictures, the black and whites and the colors, the Fox and the Grodin sets, should have been taken at almost exactly the same time. The body's brought in, it's unwrapped, it's laid on the table, and x-rays are taken. We know from the record, they say the room is cleared while x-rays and photographs are taken. So there should be no substantial differences, particularly in the body or the position of the body or what we see between the Fox and the Grodin sets. The problem is there are. Not only is it the blurred forehead anomaly, but there are other indicators that the body has been moved between the taking of the two pictures. Note the towel here, the blue stripe on the towel. It's actually navy blue, and under the head, you can't see it here, but you can see it in the left lateral shot, is the Navy Medical Corps insignia. Obviously, the head is resting in such a position, the body is at such, that this towel is well above the ears, okay? In other words, the body is at what we'd call down the autopsy table from this stripe on the towel. Yet, even accounting for the difference in the angle, when we get to the Fox photographs, when we look at the Fox photographs, the stripe is under the neck almost, in the rear here. It should be appearing at least along in here if this picture were taken at the same time as this picture. Again, it's under the head. You see, if you were moving around here with the camera, okay, this line would not change its orientation to the ear. It would still be above the ear. So when you stay on this side of the table, it's not going to shift downward and appear to be under the neck as it does in the Fox photographs. And obviously, what you can surmise from this is that the body has been rolled up maybe, or taken off the autopsy table, or what have you, placed back on it. The head is much higher up here. You can see the bar here, the drip edge of the autopsy table. So some amount of time has passed between the taking of those two photographs. Yet another indicator that time has elapsed between the taking of the Fox set and the Grodin set. Again, here you're looking at F1, the Fox stare of death. It's very obvious, painfully obvious, that the mouth is widely agape in this photo, or relatively widely agape. It seems to hang down almost as if there's been a stroke here on the left side, and that would correspond to having a massive wound to the right side of the brain. The left side would go limp. You can see it better to some degree in the left lateral shot. The left eye here is sort of droopy, but the right eye is wide open, and you can actually see the outline of the pupil. You can see all of the pupil, which is dilated or opened widely in this picture. Yet, when we go back to the Grodin shot, once again, we see that's not the case. Again, looking at the right eye, it is very droopy and nearly closed, and you can see that the upper and lower eyelids are not only covering most of the iris but also part of the pupil. Now, you may not be able to tell it from the contrast in this, but in the actual photograph you can tell that perhaps a good bottom half of the pupil is closed, and also the mouth here is partially closed. Now, I've had several doctors and autopsists look at this, and they confirm this. But again, they find nothing unusual in it, in that if the body is being handled and manipulated, this may occur. It's just one more point that shows you that time has elapsed between the taking of the black and whites and the colors, that there's apparently some changes to the body, namely this item here, this V incision, and the body's position has changed on the autopsy table. Let's move from the subject of a time lapse occurring on the body into some evidence of perhaps photo alteration. This is an enlarged version of Fox F3, and again it corresponds roughly to the other two Grodin shots too. The color one, which I'll put up here again in a minute. The detail on the color, though, since it was taken off a video, is not nearly as good as this. This has got perhaps the best resolution of any of the pictures. And this area here, which is the occipital parietal area, the much discussed neighborhood of an exit wound, as described by various witnesses. Just to give you one of the most recent accounts, Harry Livingstone and I interviewed Jim Metzler earlier this year at the studios of WCHE, and he pointed right to this area as being the area where he felt the exit wound on the back of the head was. And of course, if you look at this, and you can see it here, and some of these items have been pointed out in high treason. Robert Grodin has noted, and Harry Livingstone, that you have wet hair here, you have dry hair here, and if you look at this margin here, and this is a Harry Livingstone theory, and I tend to concur with it, it seems to be airbrushed into there, that it's actually been blown in there, and you've got that I don't mean to sound comical, but the dry look right there as opposed to the wet look. But the point is that this is all intact. And if you remember the Dallas doctors on Novas, they talked about how the hand was maybe pulling the scalp up. Well, the problem with that is, as Metzler defined, see, the Dallas doctors say this finger and up here is pulling it up over a defect back here. But as Metzler described it, the defect tore the scalp here, and of course there are many other statements made about the scalp being torn, being blasted away. But just to put it in the most contemporary and simplest terms, Metzler talked about this part here being torn so that you'd pull it up like a window shade. In other words, if you were going to cover the wound, you wouldn't pull up on it because this area would open up and gape open. You'd pull down here over and overlap the wound. And of course, if they are in fact pulling up here, then that makes this large area here where you see dry, slightly out of focus, perhaps airbrushing of this photograph. So again, I think the case, Grodin has talked about a mat insertion. Lifton has talked about a prosthetic device being used to cover the head. I think the matter may be a lot simpler than that, as Livingstone and I have discovered, which is that it appears that this area is very simply airbrushing. For those of you who may be new to the case, of course, this is the alleged entry wound for the fatal headshot. And when you look at, again, this blow-up of Fox F3, a number of things become apparent. Number one is it does not appear to perforate the scalp. Number two, and this is rather conclusive, in detailed examination of that photograph, it appears that there is actually hair growing out of that wound. In any case, it's not nearly the well-defined wound that we were led to believe it was when the drawings from the House Select Committee were released. Let me show you again Ida Dox's drawing F47 there, where the wound is nice and dark and well-defined there as an entry wound. Again, it's very hard to tell on this poor quality color copy exactly if that where that wound lies, but it's not the vivid, well-defined wound that we are led to believe it is in the doc's drawings. It appears to be, I interviewed 5 doctors, they told me it appeared to be a second-degree burn. So we have a problem here on the Fox pictures. Perhaps they were enhanced on the color pictures, and we're going to get into that in a moment. Color enhancement or colorization of the color pictures we'll talk about in just a moment. But this seems to have been carried out in several instances in the photographs. Again, remember, you're supposedly looking at a penetrating, skull-puncturing entry wound there. Look at it very closely, and you can see it really doesn't meet the criteria for that. One of the problems that we have, again, in comparing the Fox photos with the Grodin photos is a contrast anomaly. Now, you may say, well, that's got to be a very subjective argument there. And in many respects, it would be seeing what is black and white, what goes from black and white to color. But there are some basic physical laws in photography, just as you cannot have the background and the foreground in focus and something in the middle out of focus. Red goes to black, goes to a very dark color in black and white photography. This is Autopsy Photo G5 of Grodin's, printed in high treason, and remember it was printed in black and white. And when you view the color photograph, one of the things that strikes you about it, as far as being really one of the most gory of the photographs, is that these 3 areas here, 3 streaks, as Harry Livingstone recalls them, of gory crimson red, and I have in my notes recorded the very same thing. 3 very deep crimson, bloody red streaks of presumably torn scalp or tissue or what have you here at the area of the large defect in the top of the head. Just very, very bright red. And as you can see here, the hair is dark and black, and these are a very dark color. Now, there are other areas, like we know that there's blood here around the ear, and you see it appears dark. If we pan down just a little bit to what we can see of the throat wound, you can also tell there that from just the margin you can see of it here, of the tracheotomy incision, that it appears very dark. It's very blood red. All these areas in the color photographs are very crimson and very bright red. And again, I point to here, when the discussion we just had, this area here wouldn't go to reference black when it was taken in the Fox photos. That's one of the points that underscores the argument I just made. But getting into the new argument about contrast, you see how dark this is. very dark because in the original photo, or at least in the photo that Grodin has shown us, it's very blood red. So it comes out very dark when converted to black and white, right? Well, I'm afraid not. Not when you get to the Fox photographs. Remember the Grodin photographs, they are bright red. Here, they are obviously not red. I mean, we have other indications. Now, if these were the red going to this shade of light here, it just doesn't compute. It defies the laws of photography if they're taken of the same scene. And you cannot just say that because of the different angle they were taken at, because again, how would you support the argument that this, when you're taking a shot from over here more direct on in the Fox photographs, turns out so black? It's just totally inconclusive, the contrast. It appears that these areas may have been colored in, that there is some indication of a colorization. And you say, well, why would that be? Well, it could be either the colorization of the color photographs or a colorization to a likeness in the black and whites. I think one of the reasons may be is in the black and whites, when I've shown these, again, I've interviewed a number of pathologists about this, they say that this material here appears to be torn and convoluted brain tissue. In other words, that the brain's in the head. Whereas here, when you're looking at basically what looks like torn scalp tissue, the issue of whether or not the brain is in the head becomes very inconclusive. Is it possible that that area of brain was changed to red so that it would confuse that issue? I'm not certain, but I do know this. This red that we see here is not the same as what is really got to be grayish and whitish matter that we see here. This is the contrast anomaly or the colorization problem. I want to just digress for a moment to cover Fox Photos F8, F9. Remember, initially we had them oriented with this gaping hole here toward the top. But what I found out when carefully examining these photos and as we made light enhancements of them was this. I realize this is going to be very hard to see on this picture, but it is very apparent in the photographs. We know from some of the testimony of the Bethesda autopsy personnel that at various times they were sent out, at least one of them, to retrieve a specimen jar. And if you look here, you can see the lip of the specimen jar and the body of it this way, so that this is obviously up. Assuming you wouldn't set a jar in any other position, this appears to be a jar sitting up on the table, and we can even see the faint outline of the table here. So we have like a horizontal plane, and this jar here, this being the lip, is obviously in the vertical plane. What does that mean? Well, let's pull back and take a look at what it means when the picture is oriented like that. If the picture is oriented in that position, again, here is our jar that we were just zooming in on, and this is, the table is flat under us here, then this area here would seem to be in the right rear part of the skull. And keep in mind what I said, Jim Metzler said, if you were going to peel the scalp up or pull the scalp, you'd pull up from the bottom and fold it up. Here's the scalp folded over. And perhaps this is the only photograph we're looking at in the original autopsy photographs that has survived intact without alteration, airbrushing, or contrast enhancement. I don't think anyone has ever been able to aptly define why the ruler is there, except that it's supposedly measuring this large defect, but it's not. There's nothing there. There's no landmark to reference it to, and I think the House Select Committee's experts talked about that measurements were made without reference to certain landmarks. But we have a very, very disturbing landmark up here on the left side, in that this jar, if setting upright on the table here, obviously would position the head so that we're looking, this is the top of the head, the scalp's reflected up, and we're looking at a gaping hole in the right rear of the head. Remember earlier when I showed you this picture, this is Fox F4 Grodin, or Grodin G2. Grodin G2 is the same shot, only the background appears to be washed out. You might say, well, why would that be? Again, going back to the fact that perhaps the Fox photos were early and the Grodin photos reflect a more refined and later set. When you examine the photos, a good tile layer always puts these short tiles at the inside wall. Yet we have here an obvious, strange, shortened tile in the middle of the wall. Now, when I first saw this, I assumed that perhaps this wall sloped back here. It was sort of a beveled opening. According to the Bethesda personnel that I've interviewed about this issue, that's not the case. This wall was flat and was a square corner. You have a short tile here on an outside corner, which is in and of itself a little bit unusual because you'd think they'd put it on the inside, but here now we have a strange line that really runs the whole length of the picture and intercepts the picture, unfortunately, at one of the most troubling points, and that is right at the hairline. There appears to be some contrast problems in this area. You remember at least one Dallas doctor said something about a wound on the left side of the head. We have a apparently almost reference black. It's not as pronounced as what's happening on the other side of the head for whatever reason, but we have a little anomaly that is there also. Moving through some other points, perhaps minor points, but perhaps nonetheless important. The Dallas personnel spoke to the issue that they washed the body of the president. If the president sustained a massive wound on the right side of his head, particularly sloping downward some, as we are led to believe in the Zapruder film, then obviously, even though he eventually falls over to his left, there would be a great deal of blood behind the ear. Remember how your mother always told you to wash behind your ears? It's an area because of the slope of the head. It's almost like a rain channel. If you've been out in the rain bareheaded, you know that the water runs down and gets in the crease over top of your ear and runs down your ear. And blood would be expected to do the same thing. Yet in this color photo from the Grodin Collection, we can see the area behind the ear is very white, yet the earlobe itself is very bloody. And that's apparent, of course, when we go to the corresponding Fox photo here. Again, we have a better angle in behind the ear because the cameras drop down when it's taking Grodin 3 and 4. But you can see the area behind the ear is very white, yet the ear itself, this lobe area here, the lobe, the anti-reflex, which is sort of the inner lobe, they call it, is somewhat smudged and dirty with blood. And you might say, well, what's the significance of that? Well, the significance is that if the area had been cleaned to any degree in Dallas, and this seems to indicate the fact that behind the ear is clean, tends to indicate that perhaps it was clean, yet the outside of the ear has become dirty, that the outside smudging of blood on the ear occurred. And again, I want you to back this up. Look at the great amount of blood smudges on the autopsist glove. It reinforces the argument that these pictures are taken far into the body being there and being handled. In other words, the blood got on the outside of the ear because the autopsists had been handling the body, and they began handling it and placing their hands on the ear, and they got the ear bloody because they had blood on their hands. And you say, well, it's an autopsy. They're supposed to have blood on their hands. But remember, it's an autopsy. These are supposed to be presentation pictures. Why is there so much smudging on the body around the neck area? You know, this area here, again, if the body had been washed, and it seems to be it was, we have wet hair here. If the body was washed at Parkland to some degree, and that washing removed the blood from behind the ear, why did it not remove the blood there? You know, if they did wash that blood off, how did it get back on there? It more than likely got back on there because the body has been handled a great deal. And just for reference sake, let me go to the blow-up there of F3, and you can see that much clearer that it appears to be smudges of blood along the ear, while the area behind the ear appears to be white. And another good indication of the fact that you have the body's been handled quite a bit really shows up very well in Fox F5 here. And I'm slightly obscuring his glove there so you can make sure you see this. Fox F5, you can see that his up to his wrist is very bloody, which indicates that perhaps he's been doing quite a bit. Again, this glove is very bloody. There's a great deal of blood stain here on the body, and of course post-mortem abrasions, which Lifton pointed out in Best Evidence. Again, it goes to the question is, if the body is taken out, placed on the autopsy table, and the initial photographs, which would presumably be those stare of death photographs, F1, F2, Grodin's G5 shot there where you see the right profile, and then the body is rolled up, why have these guys gotten so bloody already? I think the answer to that question is quite simple. They've gotten bloody because there's been a great deal more done with the body, as far as perhaps removing bullets from the brain or removing the brain itself before these pictures have been taken. We all know that it's painfully obvious that these pictures do not in any way support the x-rays, which show, of course, that the right front part of the head is blasted away and that this area here is blasted away. And in fact, I've had surgeons speak to me about how this wound here, how this bone is missing here in this semicircle. There are half-inch nips out of it, which is a typical surgical bone cutting tool does that, takes half-inch nips out. So we know time elapsed between the Grodin and the Fox sets. We know a great deal of time elapsed between both of those and these x-rays, because obviously if these are the president's x-rays, the bone in the right forehead has been removed, and it appears here that it has been surgically removed. So let's review what we've discussed in the last 46 minutes. Number one, the incision, the V incision apparent in the Grodin pictures is not in the Fox pictures. It appears in the Fox pictures, based on this reference black anomaly, Anomaly 1, that it's being photographically obscured for whatever reason. There's apparently some other photographic obscuration going on in that area to the left of that incision, where we saw the triangle and then we saw the dot with the X. There's a color problem, a contrast problem. Red in the Grodin photographs does not necessarily translate to black in the Fox photographs, more so than what could be explained by differences accountable for by exposure of the film, type of film, filters being used, what have you. The purpose served, again, is that it confuses the historical anthropologists looking at those pictures as to whether they're looking at brain tissue or whether or not they're looking at scalp tissue that's bloody. Again, we have the classic case of the photo x-ray conflict. We also have the case that on the back of the head shots, when we look at the enhanced version of the back of the head shots, the purported entry wound just doesn't meet the description that it would have to be the entry wound to then cause the damage it does when it exits. And again, looking at the Ida Doc's drawings, that wound was darkened in. There was I guess you could say, a manual colorization going on there with that photograph. We've looked at the positioning of the body. We know that there's an elapse of time between the taking of the color and the black and white photographs. Perhaps more time than would normally be accounted for by just having the Gerald Stringer changing the cartridges in the cameras and switching from black and white to color. Too much time. It's evidenced by the blood smears on the body at various areas. It's evidenced by the fact that the body has moved on the table between those different ones. Another point I perhaps forgot to mention, I pointed out in the left lateral shot, the Fox shot, that you can see the phone on the wall and the discrepancy there in the tiles. Could that explain the reason why that background is blacked out in the Grodin photographs? Again, it does not appear, at least in the Grodin photographs I saw, it does not appear at all. You see none of that background. You see only the president's left side of his face and a little bit of the towel under his head, but you do not see that wall there. Is that because the wall, like whatever's being blacked out in Fox F1 and F2, is also a smoking gun? I realize that over the last 45 minutes or so, I've given you a lot of pieces to the puzzle. Maybe no clear picture has emerged yet. To some of you, maybe it has. But let's just review real quick. There appears to be evidence in the photographs of photo alteration. airbrushing at the back of the head there, and colorization or contrast enhancement, the blurred forehead anomaly problems. Photo obscuration, the blurred forehead anomaly, where it's hiding something. There appears to be body manipulation, a moving of the body, a rather drawn-out lapse of time, and an overall filtering or piecing together of the evidence. And what you get into here is what I call the buffet of evidence theory. We know from several sources, including the record, that there appears to have been a perpetual taking of photos and x-rays that night at Bethesda. I believe this was done, and I believe that the best, or by best I mean the ones which would most support a rear entry front exit shot, were taken, and those were altered to cover anything which would contradict that, altered or obscured. And they also would give you some indications of perhaps body alteration, but it's not really body alteration, it's simply the normal processes that are going on as the body is on the table at Bethesda. The obvious question is why, and again, I believe the overall record has been manipulated to obscure the fact that there was a frontal entry rear exit fatal head wound. There are two other critical observations that I feel underscore this belief, and I'd like to take a look at those for you. If there was a front to back shot and a rear exit,